She thought she knew the man she loved, until one moment changed everything. In a life that looked perfect on the surface, cracks began to form. Small at first, almost invisible. But behind the smiles were secrets, behind the promises were lies, and behind the love was betrayal waiting to be revealed. When the truth finally comes crashing down, it doesn't just break her heart, it ignites something stronger. Because this time, she won't be the victim. She'll be the one who takes control, who rises from the ruins, and who proves that losing everything can be the beginning of becoming unstoppable. The lesson? Sometimes the truth hurts, but it also sets you free. The people who betray you don't define you. How you rise after does. Strength isn't about never falling, it's about refusing to stay down. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and support the channel. Your support means everything and helps us create more powerful stories like this. Thanks for watching.
With his baby due in just 8 weeks, Arthur told his wife the library had to be cleared out. Not because they needed a nursery or were renovating, but because his star programmer, the woman coding his next billion-dollar investment, needed their quiet, wood-paneled study to host an all-night hackathon for potential investors. And it got worse. The programmer, Victoria, had the priceless collection of 16th century manuscripts moved by a standard crew, causing an irreparable crack in a centuries-old binding. She referred to Elara, a former master book conservator, as Arthur's sweet but overly delicate wife, who was lucky he was building such a powerful future for them. And the husband, the venture capital titan who built a 10-figure fortune on code and confidence, allowed it. Every time, he chose the startup. What neither of them realized was that the quiet woman they treated like a fragile antique was the sole heir to the $500 billion Davenport Foundation, a global banking and arts preservation dynasty. For 3 years, she had hidden her identity, desperate to be loved for her heart, not her holdings. Now she had her answer, and the phone call she was about to make would liquidate their entire world. The lesson of this story is critical. It's a truth most people learn far too late. You should never judge a person's power by the volume of their voice. The quietest person in the room is often the one holding the winning hand, and the person you write off today might just be the one who owns your company tomorrow. Real love is not about choosing what is convenient. It is about choosing what is right, with integrity, every single time. If this story resonates with you, if it reminds you of your own hidden strength or of watching someone you know be completely underestimated, I want to hear about it in the comments. Tell me, have you ever been profoundly misjudged by the very people who were supposed to cherish you? I read every single comment, and if you're new here, please subscribe and turn on notifications. We tell stories about strength, about justice, and about people who refuse to be made small. Share this with someone who needs this reminder today. We need to clear out the library for a few days. My lead developer needs the space for a demo, Arthur said, his eyes glued to the pitch deck on his tablet. The cool glow made him look like a stranger. For a second, Elara was sure she'd misunderstood him. She stood in the archway between the kitchen and the living room, a hand resting on the swell of her belly. 8 months. The baby gave a sudden sharp kick, as if he already understood a truth his mother was just beginning to accept. "I'm sorry, what was that?" Elara asked. "Victoria is flying in from Zurich tonight," Arthur said, not looking up. "She's bringing the alpha build of the new AI platform. We're hosting the seed round investors here for a marathon coding session. She needs the library as a command center. The climate-controlled vault at the office is perfect for your books. It's just until we close the deal." Just until we close the deal. The phrase tasted like ash. Elara had just spent the last week cataloging the collection. They were her grandfather's, the only part of her former life she had brought into this one. She wanted her son to grow up surrounded by their history. "Arthur, I'm 8 months pregnant," she said, her voice even. She had learned how to be even. "Working with them helps me relax. The environment in that room is perfectly balanced. My doctor said it's vital to—" "Elara." He finally met her gaze. He had on the face he used in pitch meetings when a subordinate dared to question his timeline. It was a look of infinite condescension. She is the best coder in the valley. This is a $500 million valuation on the table. Let's not create unnecessary friction. Let's not create unnecessary friction. As if her life's work, her inheritance, and the child she was carrying were nothing more than static in his grand broadcast of success. She started to speak, but then stopped. "All right," she whispered. Later that day, she went to the office vault. It was a cold metal room designed for servers, not for delicate vellum and ink. The books, stacked in cheap cardboard boxes, looked like discarded evidence. The air was dry and smelled of ozone and machinery, a world away from the cedar-scented library where they belonged. Alara sat on the floor, the hostile silence of the room closing in. She placed both hands on her belly. "It's all right, little one," she murmured to her son. "We are all right." But her hands trembled, not with rage, but with the cold, hard shock of realization. She was an acceptable loss. After the deal, after the startup, after his reputation, after his ambition, and after Victoria. She was number 6 on his priority list. Their son was number 7. She rested her head against the cold steel of a server rack and stared at the opposite wall. A bundle of Ethernet cables hung down like dead vines, a messy, functional solution no one cared enough to fix. She breathed in for a count of 4, held for 4, and exhaled for 8. It was a technique a conservator had taught her for steadying her hands before delicate work, a way to count heartbeats instead of screaming all the things she truly wanted to say. In their penthouse across the bay, Arthur's phone would be buzzing. His voice would be a low, confident murmur. "It's all set. She's totally on board. You know, Alara, she's understanding." Understanding. She pushed the heels of her hands into her eyes until she saw stars. She was understanding. The next morning, Alara rose at sunrise, her back aching from a sleepless night. She made the espresso Arthur liked, setting out the specific vitamins he would otherwise forget. She knew the 1,000 trivial data points of his life. She was still waiting for him to learn even one of hers. At 10 a.m., she decided to return to the vault. She had to see the books again to feel the familiar texture of the leather bindings. She keyed in the code and slid the heavy door open. She pulled down a corner of a box flap. A small digital sensor she had hidden inside was blinking red. Critically low humidity. A long white crack ran like a lightning strike across the dark, ornate binding of a priceless manuscript. A deep, sickening wound. Taped to the inside of the box was a post-it note, the handwriting a sharp, efficient scrawl she knew belonged to Victoria. "Had to get the movers to clear this stuff for the server setup. Tad dry, but they're just books. We'll sort it after we launch. V." Alara read the note 5 times. She folded it into a tiny, sharp square and placed it in her pocket. She stood perfectly still. The low hum of the servers was the only sound, a machine preserving data while history turned to dust next to it. She traced the crack with her finger. She did not weep. She was not a woman who wept. And she was beginning to realize that was the entire problem. Victoria arrived at 1 p.m. She entered the penthouse like a conquering general, her energy electric and impatient. She was in expensive, minimalist athleisure wear, an expression of supreme focus on her face. She smelled of burnt coffee and a perfume that could have been named disruption. "Alara," Victoria said, her greeting a clipped sound. She didn't offer a hand. Her eyes scanned the library, now a nest of cables, monitors, and whiteboards covered in algorithms. So much better. That old paper smell was killing the creative flow. "Hello, Victoria," Alara said. "Good trip?" "Productive. The beta testers in Tokyo found a critical bug, but we patched it on the flight." She walked past Alara and adjusted a monitor. "I had them swap out the warm lighting. Blue spectrum light is better for coding marathons, more productive." She nodded toward a small framed photo of Alara's grandparents. "That's a bit sentimental." Arthur came out of his home office. He greeted Victoria with a quick, energetic hug that was more than just professional. Victoria's smile was a sudden burst of light, reserved only for him. "Arthur," she said, her hand on his forearm, You look wired. Getting enough sleep? I'm good, V. Ready to ship. You need to be at 110%. I ordered us some clean keto for dinner. You can refuel, she said, giving Alara a sideways look. You probably need your rest. That night, they ate organic steak and kale out of compostable containers. Victoria had ordered for all three. She handed Arthur his container first, then took her own. As if remembering she was there, she slid a box across the table toward Alara. Picked out a name yet? Victoria asked, spearing a piece of steak. We were thinking of Oliver, Alara said softly, after my grandfather. Oliver Knight, Victoria repeated, tasting the words. A bit old-fashioned, isn't it? You want a name with an edge, something that sounds like a founder, like Jackson or Riker. She said it with a little laugh, a sound that positioned Alara's sentiment as obsolete. Alara looked at Arthur, waiting. He was scrolling through lines of code on his phone. He said absolutely nothing. The silence lasted for 5 heartbeats. 5 heartbeats is an instant, unless you are waiting for the man who swore to protect you, to defend you, and the son you are about to bring into the world. Then it is a lifetime. Alara placed her fork down. Excuse me, she said. I think I'm going to turn in. She went to their bedroom, shut the door, and sat on the bed. She touched the smooth, cool glass of her phone. She would not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. Not this time. It was never about the books. It was about the 5 heartbeats. She could smell the faint scent of Victoria's perfume on his jacket, which was already tossed on the floor. Chloe had placed a stark, illuminated data sculpture on the baby grand piano. It's an algorithmic piece, she announced, her voice crisp. It visualizes market volatility. It anchors the room in the now. She was systematically purging their home of Alara's warmth, erasing every trace of her quiet, literary world. Alara curled deeper into the plush wool sofa. Her chamomile tea had gone cold. She gazed out at the gray waters of Puget Sound. Over the next 3 days, Chloe's conquest of the penthouse was total. She had Alara's cherished Persian rugs replaced with severe monochromatic ones. She briefed the housekeeper on a new minimalist protocol for entertaining. The digital frames that once held photos from their trip to the San Juan Islands now cycled through glowing profiles of Vance Capital's portfolio CEOs. And she talked. She talked constantly about Arthur's vision, his influence, the kind of people he aligned with. That biotech founder from San Diego was a powerhouse, Chloe remarked on the second night. Isabel Voss. Her father practically invented gene sequencing. They would have been an absolute dynasty. But Arthur picked you, her thin smile suggested, as if it were a charming, inexplicable folly. Alara gathered the discarded cocktail napkins. That night, wide awake in the guest room's rigid bed, Alara thought of the woman she was before this life. The woman who curated rare book collections. The woman who knew the weight of history, not just the price of an IPO. She remembered who she was before Arthur, before this glass and steel Seattle penthouse, before her life had been so exquisitely managed that it had become a gilded, airless box. She met him in a cluttered, book-lined archival office in Belltown, the air smelling of old paper and binding glue. She was delicately restoring the spine of a 17th century maritime atlas, her hair pinned up haphazardly, wearing a worn cardigan over a simple shift dress. No driver, no assistant, no mention of the family name that made university presidents clear their calendars and auction houses hold their breath. He had barged in, crackling with the kinetic energy of the tech world, demanding to see the head archivist. She had shown him the intricate work she was doing. He said he was impressed by her focus. She said she was a freelance archival consultant, which was completely true. She preserved invaluable pieces of history, just usually for the $90 billion philanthropic foundation her family had started 6 generations prior. She left out the part where her great-uncle had discovered a lost Shakespeare folio, the part where she held a seat on the acquisitions committee. and the part where her personal collection of first editions could swallow his venture capital fund without a trace. Their first date was at an aggressively trendy restaurant in Capitol Hill. He spoke for 2 hours straight about his investments, his strategy, his relentless mission to fund the next world-changing technology. His fund was worth over $200 million, a figure he treated as a personal accomplishment. He'd built it from nothing, no family connections, no Ivy League safety net, just pure audacity and a hunger to be on the winning side of the future. She had found his drive thrilling back then. He had built a $200 million kingdom, and it was the sun around which his entire existence revolved. She'd been born into 90 billion and had spent her whole life hoping someone would see her, not her endowment. He never asked about her other projects. He never asked about her family. He never once typed her name into a search engine. In those first few months, she mistook his self-obsession for a deep respect for her autonomy. It was only much later that she recognized it as a profound, impenetrable narcissism. He wasn't interested in her world because he was the entire solar system of his own. They were married within a year, a small, stunningly chic ceremony at the Chihuly Garden, and glass with just 60 guests. Elara's side of the aisle was nearly empty. Her brother, Julian, was there, his quiet amusement making the champagne seem even drier. He flew in from London, pulled her aside near a vibrant glass sculpture, and whispered, "Are you absolutely certain about this, Ellie?" She was certain. She was so beautifully, naively certain, in a way that only someone who has never known true risk can be. Arthur's brand strategist Chloe was at the wedding, a vital strategic partner, he'd called her. She scanned the fantastical, colorful gardens with a sharp, clinical eye. "It's very artisanal," she had commented to Elara, who had covered the entire cost from an account she told Arthur was a small fund from her grandmother. The small fund was the $90 million result of selling a minor Monet. Now, curled on a daybed in her reading nook, she replayed the highlight reel of their romance, Arthur bringing her coffee at the archive, Arthur calling her his anchor, his true north, in a tone that made her feel seen and essential. Every memory was now spoiled, not because the moments weren't real, but because she could finally see the agenda behind them. He loved her when she was a quiet, beautiful artifact in his fast-paced world, when she was admiring, when she was simple. The word hung in the air, simple. From his home office down the hall, she could hear Arthur's confident voice on a conference call. He laughed. "No, she's fantastic. A bit of a traditionalist, but so genuine. She's going to be a wonderful mother." Elara laid a hand on her belly. The baby fluttered, a soft, insistent pulse beneath her palm. "I hear him," she thought. "I hear him too." The next morning, Arthur told her he had a surprise. "Chloe connected us with her design firm. They're the biggest name in the Pacific Northwest. They do all the tech billionaires' homes." "She's already put them on retainer for us," Arthur said, beaming. "They're going to consult on the nursery." "I have a plan," Elara said, her voice quiet. "I was going to use the rocking horse my grandfather made. I have the antique bookshelf from my childhood room." "Honey," Arthur said, the endearment a smooth veneer over his impatience. "I'm sure that's nice, but this is Chloe's personal firm. This is top tier. Our daughter deserves the absolute best, don't you think?" He was already looking at his phone, his focus shifting to a pitch deck. "I want to do it myself," Elara said, her voice gentle but firm. "It's important to me. My mother—" "They can work in your pieces," Arthur interrupted, making a placating gesture. "Chloe says they're amazing at integrating a client's personal vision." "She says," Elara repeated, the words feeling like dust in her mouth. "I'm just thinking about our family's brand, Ellie. This is a huge win for us. You're thinking about letting your brand strategist brand my daughter's nursery." The penthouse, normally filled with the low thrum of the city below, fell utterly silent. Arthur put down his phone, his easy charm evaporating into a cold, hard annoyance. The scent of rain from the balcony suddenly felt oppressive, heavy. "Elara," he said, using his warning voice, the one that meant asterisk. This is not a negotiation asterisk. Chloe is doing us a huge favor. Just take the meeting. It's one conversation. Say thank you. Say thank you to the woman he was sleeping with, the woman who was now trying to design the life of the child she was carrying. Clara stared at her husband, truly seeing him for the first time in months. She scanned his face for a trace of the man who'd been mesmerized by her closing arguments in court, for any hint that he still saw the woman who could dismantle a hostile takeover. There was nothing. His expression was just impatient, waiting for her to agree. The easy wife, the content, uncomplicated partner. Of course, Clara heard her voice say. The words felt like a betrayal to every sharp-witted woman she'd ever admired. Later, inside the room designated for their child, she sat on the hardwood floor, studying her hands. These were capable hands, analytical hands, hands that could find a fatal flaw in a 100-page contract, hands that had held her own mother's as she signed the final papers to sell the family business, hands that had built a formidable legal career. She laid them on her swelling stomach. Her daughter kicked back, a single insistent jab. "I'm not simple," she whispered to her. "He just needs me to be." It was a foundational truth of their marriage. The proof didn't arrive on a shirt collar. It arrived on a tablet. Liam was in Singapore for a tech summit. A notification glowed on the new wall-mounted smart home hub he'd installed. It was a beta for his company's flagship lifestyle app. The message read, "Introducing Elysian Moments, a curated look back at your most cherished memories with your designated legacy contact." Clara's stomach turned to ice. She hadn't been set as his legacy contact. She touched the screen. The title read, "Building the Future." The photos showed Liam and Beatrice, his COO, smiling in asterisk her asterisk penthouse, brainstorming in asterisk his asterisk office. Then she saw it. In a shot of Liam's home office, hanging above the guest chairs, was a vintage map of the Chicago skyline she had painstakingly framed. But it wasn't the map that made her stop breathing. It was the woman in the picture. She enlarged the image of Beatrice, who was perched on his desk, looking triumphant. Draped around her neck was a unique, custom-designed data locket, a piece of wearable tech, a locket Clara recognized. She had negotiated the patent acquisition for its designer a year ago for an investor who demanded total secrecy. She recalled the proprietary microhinge and the custom code the investor requested be embedded in its firmware. For L, my North Star. B, for Liam, from Beatrice. The app's auto-generated caption sealed it. "A true partnership requires a shared vision," the text read, quoting Liam. "Beatrice gets the architecture of the dream. My wife Clara is my heart. She's the beautiful, quiet life I come home to." The betrayal wasn't just the affair, it was the public rebranding, the calculated erasure of her entire identity, displayed in perfect resolution for his future investors to see. She didn't cry. The feeling was sharp, cold, and utterly clear. It was rage, a clarifying fury that vaporized all the confusion. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in 2 years. Her old mentor answered on the first ring, his voice as precise as a scalpel. "Clara," he said, "I wondered when you call. Tell me what he's done." "He thinks I'm the B-plot," Eliza whispered, her voice strangely steady. A moment of dead air hung on the line. "He thinks... I'm sorry, what?" "He called me his inspiration," she explained. "Said I was the artistic vision, but Serafina was the business plan." A sharp, audible breath. Then Maya's voice came back, clinical and devoid of sympathy. "Eliza, tell me you are done. Say the word, and by sunrise, I will have every one of his investors pulling their term sheets." A harsh, brittle sound that might have been a laugh escaped Eliza's throat. It was immediately followed by a raw, racking sob that seemed to tear through her. Maya didn't offer platitudes. She didn't say it would be okay. She just stayed on the line, a fixed point in the chaos. When Eliza's breathing steadied, Maya spoke. "Tell me everything." And Eliza did. the smartwatch, the venture capitalist, Serafina at the benefit, the slow, deliberate campaign to reduce her from a partner to an anecdote he told over cocktails. Maya, who managed one of Chicago's most aggressive private equity funds, listened without saying a word. This was how Maya processed data. "You already know what I think about this," Maya said when she finished. "Don't." "You put him on a throne, Eliza. Now you're shocked he's looking down. You are sitting in a multi-million-dollar Lincoln Park mansion, pregnant and heartbroken over a man who thinks a $30 million exit is a dynasty. That's unfair." "Is it? You wanted him to feel like a visionary, so you acted like you didn't understand the pitch deck. He's not a visionary, Eli. He's just a guy who got lucky on a single algorithm." Eliza wiped at her eyes with her sleeve. The lights of the city glittered along Lakeshore Drive, a skyline she'd helped shape. For the first time in years, she felt like she was really seeing it. Maya was more than a friend. She was the archivist of Eliza's true identity. They had been roommates at Stanford Law. Maya was the only one who knew the real weight of the Chandler legal dynasty and the only one who had begged Eliza not to walk away from it for a romance. "You said you wanted to be valued for yourself," Maya said, her voice finally softening. "Not for your family's connections, not for your seat on the board, just you." "I remember," Eliza whispered. "But did he ever really see you, Eli? The actual you?" The question echoed in the silent room, traveling down the miles of fiber optic cable between them. The answer was brutally simple. "He saw the version of me that made his own story better," Eliza admitted. "The simpler version, the one that made him look like the genius." "That's not a relationship," Maya said flatly. "That's narrative control." After she hung up, Eliza stood by the window, watching the endless stream of headlights on the freeway. She remembered being 28, a rising star at the most powerful law firm in the city. Her father had assumed she would eventually take his place as managing partner. Her brother, Evan, was already a senior federal judge. Her path was a straight, ascending line, a life of quiet, unshakable influence. But she had seen the cost of that life. She saw her father become a stranger at his own dinner table, consumed by his cases. She saw Evan grow rigid, viewing every social event as a series of calculated risks and opportunities. Every acquaintance was a potential juror, every romance a potential liability. Eliza ran from it. She dreamed of meeting a man at an ordinary neighborhood bar who would be drawn to nothing more than her laugh. She wanted a child who would learn to ride a bike in a city park, not in the guarded seclusion of a family compound. So she left. She moved to a new city, took a low-profile consulting job, and crafted a backstory that was both plausible and forgettable. She told people her family was in academia. She claimed her father was a retired professor. She lived on a fraction of her trust fund, an amount that would have given her family's wealth manager a stroke. For a while, it felt authentic. Arthur loved her, or rather, he loved the character she'd created. The space between the two had taken 3 years to become a chasm, and now it was all she could see. She left the nursery, picked up his tablet from the nightstand, and placed it squarely in the middle of the polished kitchen island, right where he would see it. The screen was still lit, displaying the slideshow of his other life. Then she went to her office, opened her laptop, and for the first time in a very long time, logged into the Chandler & Associates secure litigation server. From her drafting table overlooking Central Park, Clara watched a flock of pigeons wheel and turn in the afternoon light. She was 7 months pregnant, and the baby was using her ribs as a jungle gym. Her husband, Liam, a real estate mogul whose ambition was a skyscraper unto itself, was on the phone in the living room. His voice, usually a warm baritone, was clipped and dismissive. Her initial concepts were a good starting point, but Audrey sees the bigger picture. A cold knot formed in Clara's stomach. She ran a hand over the blueprints for the Sterling Spire, Liam's flagship project. Her project, really. Her designs, her sustainable tech, her soul. The baby kicked, a sharp, insistent jab. "I know," she murmured, tracing the elegant lines she had drawn. "Something's wrong." Later, Liam found her still at the table. He kissed the top of her head. "Still tinkering? You should be resting." He glanced at her screen, where she was refining the building's innovative climate control system. "Audrey thinks we can simplify this. Cut costs." He said it so casually, as if Audrey Vance, his new protege, hadn't just taken a scalpel to the heart of her work. The bigger picture. He'd never said that to her before. He had always praised her vision, her unique ability to fuse art with engineering. Liam Sterling, with the confidence of a man born on third base, had decided Clara Beaumont was past her prime. He'd married her after she won the prestigious Helios Prize, thinking he'd acquired a beautiful piece for his collection, a brilliant architect content to be his brilliant wife and mother to his heir. And his new partner was clearly whispering in his ear, assuring him that Clara's time was over. A beautiful, passive footnote in his soaring legacy. Clara closed her laptop. She pressed her palms against the cool marble of the countertop, feeling the city's hum through the floor. She thought about the patents she held for the building's energy-efficient glass. She thought about the international consortium of engineers she'd personally assembled. She thought about the private offers she still fielded weekly, calls she took in her small home studio while Liam and Audrey held strategy meetings in his grand office downstairs. They saw her as a monument, admired, valuable, but finished. The baby gave a single, definitive kick as if to say, "Not yet." "You and I are not a footnote," Clara whispered back. The invitation to the Sterling Spire's official launch party had been on their mantelpiece for a month, a black tie affair for 500 of New York's most powerful people. It was an evening to cement legacies and for spouses to radiate quiet, supportive pride. 2 days before the event, Liam's mother, Genevieve, a woman sculpted from ice and old money, stopped by with a gift box from Bergdorf's. Inside was a tasteful but voluminous maternity gown in a muted shade of beige. "We want all eyes to be on Liam in the building tonight," Genevieve had said, her voice smooth as silk. "This is sophisticated, but it won't draw focus to your condition." "My condition," Clara repeated, her own voice flat. "A baby is a miracle, of course, but on a night like this, image is everything." Clara looked at the dress. It was a uniform for invisibility. "Thank you, Genevieve. It's very thoughtful." She never thought about it again. On the night of the party, Clara emerged in her own dress. It was emerald green, a column of shimmering silk that didn't hide her pregnancy, but showcased it as a source of power, a proud, beautiful curve of new life. She smiled at her reflection in the hall mirror. For the first time in months, she saw the woman who had revolutionized eco-architecture from a cramped studio in Brooklyn. When she entered the living room, Genevieve and Liam were waiting. Genevieve's perfectly constructed smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a barely perceptible crack in the facade. Liam's eyes widened with genuine admiration, but it was quickly replaced by a flicker of anxiety as he glanced at his mother. He was always glancing at his mother. "Clara, you look radiant," he managed, the words feeling hollow. "She'll be the talk of the party," Genevieve said, and it was not a compliment. She turned and swept out of the apartment without another word. The party was held in the tower's newly finished 3-story lobby. Marble, glass, and soaring ambition. Liam moved through the crush of investors and city officials with an easy charm, his hand resting possessively on the small of Clara's back. He was the king in his new castle. Genevieve was at his side, steering him toward the most important guests. Audrey Vance, sleek and sharp in black, moved with them. They introduced Clara not as the building's foundational architect, but as Liam's lovely wife. The title was meant to be a cage. He was the brand. Clara was the brand's architect. The launch party for the Sterling Spire, his new flagship skyscraper, was a universe of champagne and hushed power deals. Clara stood by the sprawling model of the tower, a hand resting on her swollen belly, sipping tonic water. She'd always been a master of observation, It's how you find the structural weaknesses in a design. That's when she caught it. Genevieve Sterling's voice, a blade wrapped in velvet. Clara's work is quaint, all that sustainable, community-focused design. It's lovely, but Liam needs vision. That's why Audrey is such a breath of fresh air. A polite, predatory chuckle from the circle of investors. They cast glances her way, a blend of dismissive sympathy and curiosity. They saw the pregnant wife, a beautiful but temporary distraction. Clara was less than 20 feet away. She heard the condescending praise for the other woman, the implication that she, the building's original consulting architect, was now obsolete. Liam was standing right beside his mother. He heard every word. Clara watched the sharp line of his jaw, waiting for him to interject, to defend her, to say, "Clara's designs are the foundation of this project." Even a slight turn in her direction would have been enough. He picked a flute of champagne from a passing tray. He raised it in a toast. He said nothing. His silence was an earthquake. Clara placed her glass on the edge of the display. She walked past the string quartet, past the raw bar, past a reporter trying to get a quote. She found an empty boardroom overlooking the glittering Manhattan skyline. Stepping into the quiet, she sealed the glass door behind her. Her hands weren't shaking from humiliation, but from a cold, precise fury. It assembled itself in her mind like a blueprint, flawless and strong. This wasn't the kind of rage that shatters glass. It was the kind that lays a foundation, only to strategically rig it for demolition later. She clasped her hands together. "I am not a feature," she whispered to the city lights. "I am the architect." She stayed for exactly 5 minutes, breathing, strategizing. Then she smoothed down her silk dress and walked back to the party. Near the bar, a man approached her, older, with the calm gravitas of old money and a watch that whispered, not shouted, its value. Simon Croft, the legendary developer who had first backed her own firm. "The man of the hour is a lucky fool," Simon said, his gaze sharp and knowing. "You're his center of gravity." He offered a thin smile. "Forgive me, your name was Beaumont before, as in the Beaumont who won the Helios Prize for that solar tower design?" "It's a common enough name," Clara replied, her voice smooth as polished marble. Her posture was serene, but a vault door slammed shut behind her eyes. Simon was a man who'd built an empire by spotting stress fractures before anyone else. Her placid denial only confirmed his suspicion. "Enjoy the view," he said, but as he moved away, he discreetly tapped a message into his phone. Clara watched him disappear into the crowd. She felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in months. Not fear, not even anger. It was the thrill of the blank page, the moment before the first line is drawn, when anything is possible. She rejoined Liam, and he draped an arm over her shoulder. It felt like a zoning claim, not a hug. Later, in the car home, Liam sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through his phone, its blue light illuminating his triumphant smile. "Audrey Vance just sent over the revised penthouse mock-ups," he said, his voice buzzing. "Incredible! Pure genius! Genevieve and I are meeting her for brunch to discuss the next phase." Clara stared at the blur of streetlights. The silence in the car was deafening. "What revisions?" Clara asked. "Just some finishing touches," Liam said, not looking up from the screen. "A bolder aesthetic, better brand alignment." But his smile was private, intimate. Clara saw it reflected in the dark window, and in that reflection, she saw the complete, unsparing blueprint of his betrayal. The apartment was quiet when Clara got home from her checkup the next day. A deep, hollow quiet. The kind of quiet that means something integral has been removed. Her appointment had been stressful. Her blood pressure was elevated dot model. Dr. Evans had looked at her over the rim of her glasses. "Are you experiencing any significant stress?" she had asked. Clara had wanted to laugh. "Just the usual excitement before the baby arrives," she'd replied. The doctor's gaze was skeptical. "Your body is a structure, Clara. A foundation under pressure will always show its cracks." The words followed her all the way home. Her body was trying to tell her something. and so was the hollow, cold feeling where the sense of belonging used to be. She drove into their building's garage and noticed a gleaming, unfamiliar convertible parked in the space beside Liam's. The motor was off, but a wave of heat still rolled off its hood. It had been driven recently. Clara entered their apartment, the sound of her shoes sharp on the concrete floors, and walked directly to the west wing. She needed to see the nursery. She'd been thinking all day about the mural, a soft, watercolor map of the stars she'd commissioned, the last creative decision she had made in this place. She eased the door open. The stars were gone. The walls were now a cold, sterile shade of corporate blue. The scent of industrial cleaner stung the air. The custom-built 6-burner gas range she'd imported from Italy was gone. The antique butcher block island, a gift from her grandfather, was gone. The walk-in pantry, stocked with artisanal flowers and spices she'd curated for years, the tiny chef's coat she'd already bought for the baby, all of it had vanished. In its place stood a sleek, sterile island of stainless steel, a row of induction cooktops, and a built-in wine fridge large enough for a restaurant. It wasn't a kitchen, it was a showroom, a caterer station. A cold, lifeless induction cooktop and a single, dramatic calla lily in a steel vase completed the scene. The heart of their home had been surgically removed and replaced with a monument to Julian Croft. Isabella stood motionless in the archway, her market bag slipping from her stunned fingers. "Where is my kitchen?" she asked, her voice hollow in the echoing space. "Oh, you're back." Chloe Vance emerged from the living area, adjusting her designer blazer with the effortless confidence of a woman who felt entitled to every room she entered. "We can set up a small kitchenette in the guest suite for you. I had the contractors come this morning. You don't really need all that fire-breathing equipment, do you?" Julian agreed. "Julian agreed," Isabella repeated, the words feeling like gravel in her mouth. "He thought it was practical. He thought it was practical to have my entire life's work torn out while I was at my 7-month checkup." Chloe finally gave her a full, dismissive look. "Isabella, I didn't throw out anything valuable. It was just an old kitchen with some clutter." Some clutter. 15 years of collecting, of perfecting, a space she had designed down to the last millimeter. It was more than a room. It was the repository of her soul, the place where she was going to teach their son to cook. Isabella turned and walked toward Julian's home office. He was on a video call at his sprawling glass desk. She stood there in the doorway, a ghost in his world of tech IPOs, until he finally muted his microphone and glanced up. "You let your colleague donate my entire kitchen." He removed his wireless earbuds. She was trying to optimize the space for entertaining investors, to be helpful. "I don't care what she was trying to be. I'm asking what you did, Julian." "Izzy, you're getting a little emotional right now." The word hung between them, thick and condescending. Emotional. The classic one-word excuse to invalidate any feeling a pregnant woman has that a man finds inconvenient. "I built that space with my own 2 hands, Isabella said, her voice dangerously calm, the quiet before a hurricane that had been building for years. Every pot, every pan had a story. "We can just buy new things," Julian said, utterly oblivious. "That is not the point." "Then what is the point?" Isabella stared at him for 5 seconds, then 10. He was unconcerned. He didn't get it. He truly could not grasp why a woman would mourn the destruction of the one place on earth that was hers. "The point," she said, her voice now icy with clarity, "is that you always choose her. You choose her projects, her ideas, her vision, every single time, without a second's hesitation, without even the basic decency to ask me first." Julian sighed, a deep, irritated sound. "You're turning a simple renovation into some kind of personal attack." "A personal attack?" she laughed, a brittle, mirthless sound. "The kitchen asterisk is asterisk personal. Equipment can be replaced, Julian. Your business partner is supposed to be a part of your work life, not our home life. The baby won't care about a fancy stove. I will care. She turned and walked out down the long gallery white hallway, past the abstract sculpture she suddenly had the urge to push over, and into the small study she used as an office. The custom corkboard was there, blank, a clean slate where her kitchen blueprints had been pinned. Her recipe ledger, a worn, leather-bound book, sat on her desk. She opened it, reading the handwritten notes and a new recipe she'd been developing, now just a memory. Isabella collapsed into her chair, 7 months pregnant, in the office of a $20 million San Francisco penthouse. She ran her hand over the empty desk, the cool glass a stark contrast to the warmth that was gone. She began to read her recipes aloud, softly, patiently, the way you ground yourself when you feel your entire world has just been pulled out from under you. Ingredient by ingredient, step by step. Her restaurant had earned 3 Michelin stars before she was 30. Her name had been on the cover of Food and Wine 6 times. Her face was known to anyone who cared about modern cuisine, and Isabella was sitting in a silent office fighting for a butcher block island. She closed the ledger and picked up her laptop. The weak afternoon light from the window reflected off the screen as it booted up. "Enough," she whispered, a promise in the single word. Not for the baby, not for Julian, for herself. Enough. She opened their shared cloud drive, looking for the original architectural files. A folder she didn't recognize caught her eye. Project Nightingale. Curious, she clicked it open. It wasn't about the house. It was full of photos. Julian and Chloe on a trip to Kyoto he'd claimed was a solo business retreat. Julian and Chloe at a gala, his hand possessively on her waist. She thought about her cover story, about the quiet, supportive partner she'd pretended to be for 2 years. A text file opened. It was a chat log. "Isabella's pregnancy is a complication," Julian had written. "We'll handle it after the baby comes." The break didn't come with a fight. It came with the quiet click of a mouse. 2 hours after her kitchen was erased, Isabella sat in her office downloading every file. The door was closed, but not locked. She was methodically creating a zip file of betrayal when she heard his footsteps. She didn't realize he was there. "What are you hiding?" Liam stood in the doorway, arms folded, his gaze locked on the dense litigation software open on her screen. He had recognized a name, a file designation. Chandler versus Northgate. Clara minimized the window. "I was on a confidential call. I heard you say Chandler versus Northgate. What is that? Some ancient case? Are you involved in something you haven't told me about? It's a professional matter." Beatrice appeared in the doorway behind him. "Are you in some kind of trouble with the law? Is that it? Are you putting my son at risk?" I told him to do a proper background check, but he insisted you were sweet. He insisted you were simple. Simple. That word again, another precise incision. "I knew that no one with your kind of polish just appears out of nowhere," Beatrice spat, her voice ringing with the triumph of someone who has finally been proven right. "And now you're here, whispering about billion-dollar lawsuits. What are you, Clara? What have you really been this whole time?" Clara stood up from her desk. She'd forgotten how tall she was when she wasn't trying to seem smaller. "I am your daughter's mother," she said. "I am carrying your child, and you are in my home, uninvited, dictating the terms of my life." "Your home?" Chloe's laugh was a quick, sharp sound like shattering glass. "This is Arthur's penthouse, our project. You brought nothing to the table." The words were precise, engineered to find the most vulnerable place. Each one was another polished stone in the wall Chloe had been building around her since the day they met. "You tied him down with that baby," Chloe said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "I see you perfectly. A quaint little librarian who stumbled into the big leagues." The air in the room grew thick and still. Alara heard the slide of the glass door. Arthur was standing in the archway. He looked from his wife to his strategic partner. Chloe's eyes immediately welled up, a masterful, instantaneous performance of distress. "What did you say to her?" Arthur demanded, his voice tight with anger. Ilara just stared at him. "Ask her what she said to me." "She's upset, Ilara." She called me a nobody. She said I trapped you. Arthur glanced at Chloe, who now produced a tissue from her pocket as if on cue. I was just trying to protect my client's future. It was about the photos, about the lies, she said, her voice trembling with a tightly coiled fury. Chloe, it's fine, Julian insisted, stepping forward to put a reassuring hand on his mistress's arm. He shot a glare at Isabella. She's our lead strategist. Show some respect. Respect? Isabella stopped, her jaw clenched. She felt a surge of adrenaline, and the baby inside her kicked, as if responding to her body's silent alarm. She remembered her doctor's words. Asterisk, your body is telling you to remove the source of the stress. I'm leaving, Isabella announced. Oh, brilliant, Julian scoffed. More drama. I am packing one bag, and I am going to a hotel. I will have my lawyer contact you to arrange a discussion that doesn't involve your business partner. That's insane. What's insane is that I am 31 weeks pregnant, and I don't feel safe in my own home. That word stopped him. Asterisk, safe asterisk. It wasn't a threat, but it carried the weight of one. For a brief moment, something shifted in his eyes. Not concern, she realized, but calculation. He was thinking about the optics. Isabella packed a single carry-on, a change of clothes, her laptop containing the files, prenatal vitamins, and her personal cell phone, which she slipped into the front pocket. She walked down the floating staircase, right past Chloe. Past Arthur, past the scent of white orchids that now felt like funeral flowers, past the kitchen where she used to read, and out the sleek, heavy front door. No one came after her. She hailed a car and rode 30 minutes to the Fairmont Olympic Hotel, checking into Suite 1405, a corner suite with a view of Elliott Bay. The room smelled of fresh linen and quiet. No orchids, no Chloe, no crushing disappointment. She sat in the window seat, wrapping her arms around her legs, the way you hold yourself when you realize you are the only one who will. An hour later, her phone vibrated. Arthur's name lit up the screen. Asterisk. This melodrama is counterproductive. Let me know when you're ready to be reasonable. A melodrama. She was nearly 9 months pregnant, sitting alone in a hotel room because his mistress had called her a gold-digging opportunist, and he called her response a melodrama. She did not write back. She placed the phone on the bedside table, screen down. The lights of the ferries moved across the water, distant and beautiful in the way things are when you are too numb to feel their charm. She ordered Dungeness crab cakes from room service. They came on a porcelain plate with a linen napkin. She ate them on the floor, watching a silent documentary about ancient redwood forests. 2 marine biologists admired a glowing comb jelly. For Elena, the scene felt almost painfully normal. The takeout, the nature documentary on the television, the comfortable quiet. It was like her first gasp of fresh air after being held underwater for what felt like a lifetime. At 11 p.m., she did something she hadn't dared to do in years. She called her father. The line rang once, twice. Lorenzo Romano answered before the third ring, his voice crisp and focused, as if he had been sitting by the phone just waiting. Elena. He said only her name, but her own voice broke when she replied, Dad. A silence stretched between them, the kind of quiet a father knows how to interpret, a silence that measures the precise weight of his child's sorrow. Tell me what happened, Lorenzo said. And so she did. She told him everything. The quiet jabs about her painting, the fights over gallery acquisitions, the gala where his mother introduced her as his charming little project, the condescending remarks about her family, the word provincial, the word emotional. Lorenzo listened, never once interrupting. 3 years of strained, careful distance dissolved in 20 minutes of raw honesty. When Elena finally fell silent, her father spoke with the chilling calm he used in boardrooms right before a hostile takeover that would obliterate a competitor. I have respected your wish to build your own life, Elena. I honored that. I honored your choices, even when every fiber of my being told me this man was a worthless asset. But if he and that mother of his endanger the well-being of my grandchild, I will cease to be a passive shareholder. Do you understand me? Elena pressed her eyes shut. She'd spent a decade escaping her father's world. The gravity of his name, the crushing influence, the way Lorenzo could bankrupt a rival with a single quiet phone call. But now, huddled on the floor of a suite at the Peninsula Chicago, pregnant and utterly alone, she didn't hear a ruthless CEO. She just heard her dad. I understand, Elena whispered. I just wanted to be good enough for him, she admitted to the silent, opulent room. But I was always up against a woman with a 35-year head start. You were never in a competition, Lorenzo stated, his voice like steel. You were auditioning for an approval he was incapable of giving. The audition is over. Elena clutched the plush hotel robe around her. The baby gave a gentle flutter, a soft tap like a tiny hand on her arm reminding her, I'm here with you, asterisk. Me too, Elena murmured back, not sure if she was talking to the baby or to herself. It was probably for both of them. Meanwhile, Richard Lowell hadn't slept in 2 days. The name Romano had been a persistent echo in the back of his mind. It was a name that felt important, but he couldn't place why. He sat in his gallery office at 6 a.m. with the Chicago skyline just a dark outline against the dawn, and he typed 2 words into the search engine, Romano Industries. The screen exploded with results. He scanned the first article, then another, and another. Leaning back in his leather executive chair, he uttered a word his own mother would have fainted to hear. $80 billion, global logistics and advanced engineering. Founded by Lorenzo Romano, number 9 on the Forbes Global Wealth Index. Enlisted on the executive board, Elena M. Romano. Elena M. Romano. Richard's quiet wife, the artist with what he thought was a small family inheritance. The woman his mother, Eleanor, had once dismissed as sweet but dreadfully unambitious. Richard snapped his laptop shut. He immediately opened it again. Then he picked up his phone and called his business partner, David. Breakfast, he commanded. My office, 30 minutes. They were in his private viewing room. Richard was drinking black coffee. David had a bagel. Richard thought about telling him he might want a scotch instead. How's Elena doing? David asked. She's fine, staying at a hotel. You know, the pregnancy hormones are making everything a bit dramatic. Right, and what about her family? What about them? Richard replied, adjusting a small bronze sculpture on his console table. What was it her dad did again? He's retired. Owned some kind of small metal fabrication business near Milan, I believe. She hardly ever talks about them. They're not important. David set his coffee mug down on the glass table with a deliberate slowness, the kind of movement a person makes when they are trying to keep her hands from shaking. Richard, did you ever, even once, actually look up your wife's family? What? Her maiden name, Romano. Did you ever just Google it? Richard let out a smug laugh, the kind of laugh a man uses when he is absolutely certain he is holding all the winning cards. Why on earth would I ever need to do that? Just humor me, David said. What is this really about? Just do it. Richard sighed and pulled his phone from his pocket. He typed in the name. He stared at the screen. His expression started to change, not suddenly, but in slow, agonizing stages, like watching a priceless painting bleach in the sun. First, a confused furrow of his brow, then a flicker of total disbelief, and finally the sick, stomach-churning realization that the entire foundation of his life was built on quicksand. This has to be some kind of elaborate mistake. It's not, David said, his voice low. I had my analyst run the numbers. Your wife is the sole heir to Lorenzo Romano. She is on the board of a corporation worth more than the entire Magnificent Mile. Including our gallery, including us. Richard just stared blankly at his phone, the bagel completely forgotten. His face was a storm of colliding emotions, utter shock, denial, a surge of fear, a flash of rage, and then even more fear, humiliation. And finally, the one emotion that truly defined him, the one Elena had always felt simmering just beneath his polished exterior. calculation. His first thought was not, asterisk, I have destroyed the person I claim to love. His first thought was not, asterisk, I have to find her and beg for forgiveness. His first thought, visible in the subtle tightening of his jaw and the way his eyes became distant and strategic, was, asterisk, how do I play this so I don't lose access to that level of power? Don't you dare, David said softly. Whatever cynical strategy you are currently mapping out in your head, delete it. I'm not mapping anything. Yes, you are. And let me tell you, as a man who has navigated this world for 2 decades, you are so far out of your league, you can't even see the sky. You're not playing chess against a grandmaster. You're playing a game where you don't even understand how the pieces move. Richard left the gallery without speaking another word. He sat in his Mercedes in the underground parking garage, the engine off, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. He stayed there for almost a full hour, replaying everything. Every patronizing remark his mother, Genevieve, had ever uttered. Every single time he had allowed her to call Clara's work boutique. The argument over the brownstone renovation. The gala for his firm. The word idealistic. The word emotional. The ironclad prenuptial agreement he had insisted upon. He had married the brilliant mind behind the Beaumont Construction legacy, a $90 billion global firm. She had kept it quiet because she wanted to build something on her own merit, and he had demolished that hope so completely that the destruction itself was a marvel. He messaged Liam. No reply. He messaged again, and again, and again. Each delivered notification without a read receipt was another steel beam in the cage he'd meticulously constructed between them. Miles away, in a Cambridge design studio, Clara was leading a virtual walkthrough for a team of urban planners. She was presenting the final schematics for a revolutionary self-sustaining community in Dubai. Her company managed projects in 12 countries. Their net zero energy builds were up 9% in demand. She was sharp, insightful, and commanding. The people on the screen addressed her as Miss Beaumont. They hung on her every word. They scribbled notes furiously. Nobody would have dreamed of interrupting her. When the call ended, she shut her laptop, rested a hand on her pregnant stomach, and murmured in a voice entirely different from the one she used with her clients. Your brother is going to dismantle his entire portfolio, brick by brick. The text glowed on the screen at 9 that night. It was from Simon, her younger, more volatile brother. Then Michael Beaumont walked in 6'2" of Boston Brahmin steel with a glare that could freeze concrete. He scanned the sleek penthouse overlooking the harbor. Then Clara, who was curled on the couch, her feet elevated. This is your command center. He said it was not a question. It is temporary, Michael. You have been drafting a life with a man who should not be allowed to choose grout, let alone co-sign your blueprints. Our grandfather said something like that. Once Granddad is right, Granddad is always right. Do not you dare tell him I said so. He sat on the edge of the ottoman, and the CEO of Beaumont Construction vanished, replaced by the big brother who had taught her how to use a T-square, the one who had threatened a university dean, who called her designs quaint. Clara, I love you and I admire your need to build your own. Name, but this is not independence. This is hiding in the attic. The woman I know does not hide. I thought I loved him, Michael. She used the past tense. Clara would not look at him. The silence that followed was a complete blueprint of the truth. To build his world, I had to shrink mine, Clara admitted. She just hadn't realized his was the size of a dollhouse. Simon, her younger brother, reached out and gripped her shoulder. He never offered platitudes. With Simon, that silence was a fortress. That same night, Audrey Vance was at Liam's Seaport condo. She was rearranging Clara's carefully chosen architectural models, searching for flaws. Flaws in what? She couldn't say. But criticism was Audrey's first language, and she was a natural. On a granite countertop, a courier tube lay unopened. It had been delivered to Clara by mistake. Inside, she found a set of rolled-up blueprints. On the title block, an inscription in Liam's hand, for the only design that matters. Audrey smirked. It wasn't envy she felt, but the satisfaction of a successful acquisition. She assumed it was for some old proposal, a relic from a life Clara had designed. She brought it out to Liam. He was on the balcony, his face lit by his phone. He'd been staring at it for days. "Your wife's quaint little projects are calling," Audrey chirped. She held up the tube. "Building plans, can you believe it? So technical." Liam glanced at the blueprints, then at Audrey. For the first time in their 6-month affair, he truly saw her, the casual condescension she called sophistication, the ambition she called passion, the hollow space in her life she tried to fill with other people's designs. But he said nothing, because admitting one error meant admitting he could be wrong, and Liam Sterling, at 41 years, had never been wrong. His phone buzzed. A secure message appeared. It was from Simon Beaumont, Clara's younger brother. It contained a single link, a news pre-release about Boston's new waterfront development project. It detailed how Sterling Tower's primary anchor tenant had just pulled their letter of intent, citing concerns about structural viability. Audrey read the sender's name over his shoulder. Her perfectly made-up face lost all color. The morning after the blueprints arrived, Liam Sterling was awake at 3 a.m. He hadn't slept. He had stood in his $12 million penthouse and watched the fog creep in from the harbor, swallowing the city whole. He showered and dressed in his most powerful suit. It was the Navy one he wore for zoning board approvals. He checked his reflection. He looked like a man who built skylines. He had never felt more like a fraud. He drove to a sleek glass tower in the financial district. He didn't know the address. He found it on a list of architectural award nominees. He stood in the lobby and called Clara. She picked up on the second ring. "I saw," he said. "Saw what, Liam?" "About Audrey, about the penthouse, about all of it." A pause, lasting 2 heartbeats. Then, "How?" "The blueprints," he said. "They were delivered to the office yesterday." Another, longer silence. "I need to talk to you," he said. "I am in your lobby. I will be down." She emerged from the elevator 3 minutes later. She wore dark jeans and a simple cashmere sweater. No jewelry, no makeup, her hair tied back in a messy bun. She looked like the fierce, brilliant designer he had first met, the version of her he had convinced her to soften. But something else was there now. She moved with the quiet certainty of someone who has just won a contract that will redefine a city. "Clara," his voice broke. "Honey, I did not know. Why did not you tell me? We could have..." "Could have what? We could have been an empire. Built a legacy. I would have treated you." He left the sentence unfinished, hoping she would fill it with forgiveness. He watched her see the confession for what it was. "Differently," she completed for him. "You would have treated me differently. That is not, no, that is exactly it. If you had known my family founded Beaumont Construction, you would have been more careful. You just said it. And Liam, that is the entire problem." He raked a hand through his hair, a nervous tic from when a project was about to collapse. "I gave you 9 years, Liam," Clara said, her voice solid, foundation solid. "I gave you every chance to value the partner who was designing a life with you, not just the portfolio piece you thought you had acquired. You failed, not because you had a mistress, but because you never believed our partnership was your cornerstone project. Because when your mother called my work charming, but insignificant, you nodded. When Audrey convinced you to sell the Eames chair my grandfather gave me, you called it decluttering. When I told you I felt like I was disappearing, you told me I was being overly sensitive. My mistress, she is just driven. Your mistress called my family's legacy dated furniture. And you called it curating your public image. She called me an emotional anchor on your brand. She told you to protect your gallery from my quaint sentimentality, and you agreed. Every single time, you agreed." Richard's eyes were glistening, but Clara had learned to distinguish the tears of a man in pain from a man in trouble. These were the latter. He wasn't crying because he was remorseful. He was crying because he was exposed. The gallery's grand archway parted. Genevieve, she had followed him from the gala. She strode in, wearing a sharp designer dress and a furious expression. "Richard, what is this display?" We have critics to manage." She paused when she saw Clara. Her lip curled. "We need to leave, Richard," she said. "This little dramatic scene is finished." "Richard," Clara said, just his name, a quiet, definitive statement. "I will not be spoken to." A black sedan pulled up to the curb. The door opened. A man stepped out, tall and distinguished, silver at the temples, wearing a suit that was a work of art in itself. He looked like an architect of empires. He moved like one. Simon Croft walked into the gallery. Michael was 2 steps behind him. The room suddenly felt like a final review board. Simon looked at Genevieve, his gaze cool and analytical, the kind one gives to a poorly executed design. "You must be the woman who deemed my protégé's architectural plans to be clutter," Simon said. Genevieve's mouth flapped open and shut. She looked like a guppy that had just discovered what a shark was. We were simply refining the brand's aesthetic," Genevieve faltered. "She was not refining," Simon said. "She was designing a home. There is a fundamental difference. I taught Clara that a life should be built on a sound foundation, not on fleeting trends. You have demonstrated why she was wise to have a contingency plan." Genevieve looked at Richard, expecting him to step in, to defend her, to be her champion. Richard stood frozen between his critic and his wife, between the woman who had praised his ambition for a year and the woman he had betrayed for 3. He remained silent. The silence stretched for 12 seconds. Clara counted, an old habit from timing structural stress tests. Simon took his protégé's arm. "Shall we go?" he said softly, as if they were leaving a dull lecture and not the wreckage of a marriage. Clara looked at Richard one final time. She searched his face for remorse, for understanding, for the faintest sign that he grasped not what he was losing, but what he had thrown away. She saw a flicker, a faint shadow of the man who had stood with her on a rooftop in Manhattan and asked her to build their life together. But a flicker isn't a blueprint. A flicker cannot support a home, and she was done seeking shelter in buildings slated for demolition. "Goodbye, Richard," she said. She walked out of the gallery into the New York air. It was October again, the cycle complete. The last of the leaves were falling, gold and crimson and the deep purple of dusk. Michael held the car door open. She got in with care, 7 months pregnant and carrying a future designed entirely by her. She was finally demolishing the past. As the car drove off, her brother's phone buzzed. Simon did not react. Michael answered. "Yes," Michael said. "This is counsel for Clara Romano. How may I assist you?" A beat, then Richard's lawyer said something Michael would later describe as the sound of a man realizing he'd just been served with a lawsuit carved from granite. 3 of Mr. Sterling's most significant backers. Sterling Galleries is reevaluating all current ventures, and our consortium is calling for the immediate withdrawal of your outstanding capital investment. Michael's voice on the phone was precise, free of emotion. It was the voice of a man who had waited 3 years for this exact call. "Thank you, Michael," Clara said. "We can take it from here." She gazed out the floor-to-ceiling window of her new penthouse, not with a sense of victory, but with a quiet feeling of liberation. Below, the lights of Manhattan sparkled against the dark expanse of Central Park. Her mentor, Simon, reached over and took her hand. He said nothing. He just held it. "You know," Clara said softly, "I spent so much time trying to escape all of this." "I know," Simon squeezed her hand, "but you weren't running from us." 6 weeks later, the baby was born. Clara had moved into a pre-war apartment on the Upper West Side. Michael had found it for her, 4 bedrooms, a private terrace, and original hardwood floors that sighed when you walked on them, a sound Clara found comforting. It meant she could always hear if someone was approaching. Michael lived 4 blocks away. Simon had leased the adjacent apartment, calling it a convenient pied-à-terre for his city projects, which in Simon's world meant he was moving in permanently, but would frame it as temporary to respect her independence. The nursery was the first room Clara finished. She didn't paint a mural, she built it herself, a miniature New York skyline made of intricate architectural models with 42 different landmarks hidden in the details. It was the same creative vision, the same steady hand, but for a space that valued it. She placed the Empire State Building above the crib, the Guggenheim by the window, and the Flatiron Building near the door. It took her 3 full weekends. No one critiqued it. No one modified her design. No one suggested it needed to be more on brand. The divorce papers arrived on a Wednesday. The proceedings were surgical, private, with no information given to the art world gossips. Michael's legal team had prepared the case with the precision of a group that had been waiting for this moment for 3 years. Richard fought back. His lawyer, Henderson, called Michael to begin negotiations. The call lasted less than 12 minutes. "My client is ready to discuss a fair division of assets," Henderson began. "Your client's gallery is valued at $60 million, a considerable sum of which was funded by investors associated with my client's professional network," Michael responded. "My client is a partner in an architectural firm with global assets held in irrevocable trusts established before this marriage ever took place. There is nothing to divide." A heavy silence filled the line. "The penthouse," Henderson ventured, "is in your client's name. He can keep it, and that ridiculous, overpriced coffee machine. What about—" Michael cut him off. "Let me be perfectly clear. Your client married Clara Romano, and for 3 years, he allowed his mother to dismiss her career as a charming hobby and re-gift her birthday presents. There is no version of this where he wins. The only variable is how much of his reputation he can salvage when it's over." Richard capitulated, though not gracefully. His business collapsed in phases. The withdrawal of capital from Simon-backed investors triggered default clauses in his loans. 2 major artist acquisitions were canceled. His top collector pulled out after hearing the personal details, not the financial ones, the other ones. It turned out that letting your mother belittle your pregnant, professionally accomplished wife was not a trait that inspired long-term business confidence. He lost the gallery 2 months later, not to Clara, but to the bank. His net worth plummeted from $60 million to $15 and then to $7. Eleanor called Clara one time. The conversation was 45 seconds long. "I suppose I should apologize," Eleanor said, her voice tight with resentment. It was the statement of a chairwoman announcing a difficult but necessary quarterly loss. "For what exactly?" Clara asked. "For any misunderstanding that may have happened." "There was no misunderstanding, Eleanor. You knew perfectly well who I was. You simply decided I wasn't important. I wasn't aware of your professional background. That is exactly my point. You were aware I was your son's wife and the mother of your grandchild, and you decided that was insufficient." A long silence crackled over the line. "I hope you find what you are looking for," Clara said. She meant it, not with kindness or spite, but with the detached finality of an architect signing a demolition order. She ended the call, set the phone down, and looked around her new home. The nursery wall was lined with her architectural models. The crib was built, and a mobile of tiny, iconic buildings turned slowly in the morning sun. The baby was born on a crisp October Tuesday. A fresh breeze blew in from the Hudson River, making the world feel sharp and new. Clara's water broke at 2 in the morning. Her brother, Michael, drove her to the hospital. Simon Croft, her mentor and new business partner, was waiting when they got there. Her new head of security, a serious man named Marcus, arrived 10 minutes later and started pacing the corridor like a jaguar who found the scent of antiseptic deeply insulting. Dr. Sharma delivered the baby at 6:47 a.m. A girl, 7 pounds, 2 ounces. She had a wisp of blonde hair and eyes that would one day be the color of a blueprint. "She is structurally sound," Dr. Evans announced with a grin. Clara held her daughter, feeling the tangible, real, incredible weight of her. A life full of promise and all the beautiful, soaring things she had yet to build. "Sophia," Clara whispered. "Her name is Sophia." For her grandmother, an engineer. Michael wept. He hadn't cried since their grandfather's funeral. He stood by the window, tears carving silent paths down his face in sheer, dumbfounded joy. Simon held Sophia for exactly 20 seconds before handing her back, his own composure fracturing. "She's so fragile," he said, his voice thick. "Are they all this small?" "She's perfectly healthy, Simon. She should have a better security system and a backup." "She does not need a backup system," Clara said, laughing. "She has us." Liam asked to be there. Clara said no. He met his daughter 2 days later with a lawyer present. Michael was there, not as her brother, but as her legal counsel. Liam sat awkwardly in a chair by the hospital window. Clara placed Sophia in his arms. He held her the way one holds a delicate glass model, with a growing horror that he was touching something irreplaceable. He cried, not for Clara, not for their marriage, and not for the sterling development empire, which was now being audited by the city for permit violations she had anonymously flagged. For the first time, Liam Sterling cried because he understood with shattering clarity what he had bulldozed. It wasn't just a marriage to a gifted architect. It was this: the warm, trusting weight of his own daughter, the absolute peace on her sleeping face, and the woman across the room who would have built a city for him, if only he hadn't dismissed her design. "She has your eyes," Liam murmured, his voice cracking. "She has her own eyes," Clara replied. A week later, something strange happened. Audrey Vance called. Clara nearly ignored it. She recognized the name. The woman Genevieve had presented as Liam's next great acquisition. "Miss Beaumont, Clara," Audrey began, her voice strained. "I know I am the last person you want to hear from. I almost did not call." "What do you need, Audrey?" I had to tell you. Genevieve came to me. She orchestrated everything, putting me in Liam's orbit. She talked about your marriage like it was a dated property she was staging for a teardown. She gave me a schedule, told me what he liked, what to say. I get it. And now he's telling everyone you were the schemer, that you hid who your family was to trap him into marriage. It didn't seem right. I thought you should hear it from someone who was actually there." Elena was silent for a long moment. She was sitting on a silk sofa in her father's penthouse library, her daughter, Sophia, asleep on her chest, the baby's gentle, steady breathing a comfort against her own skin. "Thank you, Sarah. And by the way, I saw the announcement about your new curatorial position. It's brilliant." Elena laughed, a genuine, surprised sound that bubbled up at the unexpected decency from a person who was little more than an acquaintance. "Thank you," she said again. After she ended the call, she sat with Sophia for a while. The Chicago penthouse was quiet. Snowflakes drifted past the floor-to-ceiling windows. The building hummed with its own silent, powerful energy. Her brother was bringing over deep dish pizza later. Her father was on a conference call with his legal team in Zurich. The world outside was vast and complicated, filled with people making choices, some good, some awful, some that would cast a long shadow over their entire lives. Elena looked down at her daughter. Sophia's tiny hand was wrapped securely around her index finger. Fierce, unbreakable. "I will never, ever again make myself small to accommodate a man's ego," Elena whispered to her, "and neither will you." 1 year later, Elena Romano was on the cover of Forbes, not because of the divorce, not because of Richard Lowell, and definitely not because of the tabloid frenzy about a secret heiress. Her father's legal team had made that entire narrative disappear with a series of cease and desist letters that hit the media world with the force of a tidal wave. The cover story was about the Romano Arts Foundation, the new philanthropic arm of her family's corporation. It had just launched its most audacious project yet, a partnership with an AI firm to create predictive models that could identify and help recover stolen works of art. The initiative had been in development for 3 years, and Elena had personally closed the deal. The photograph showed her standing in a high-tech data center, dressed in a sharp navy pantsuit and a simple silk blouse. She looked straight into the camera, her expression not smiling, not severe, but perfectly and utterly in command. The headline made no reference to her personal life at all. It was a Wednesday in October. 1 year since David had told Richard to Google her name. 1 year since the drive to the peninsula. 1 year since the phone call to her father that had set her back on the course of her own life. Thea was in her studio on the 57th floor of the Hancock Tower with a panoramic view of Boston stretching from the Back Bay to the Harbor Islands. The late-day sun turned the Charles River into a ribbon of molten gold. In one corner of the spacious room, a designated play area was set up. Sophie was inside, chewing thoughtfully on a silicone block shaped like the Custom House. Suspended above her, a bespoke mobile crafted from polished brass dangled miniature models of Boston's most famous bridges. Thea had commissioned it from a metalsmith in the North End. She'd kept it, not as a monument to her heartbreak, but as a testament that even the most broken structures could be repurposed into something strong and beautiful. Her drafting table was immaculate, a widescreen monitor displaying a complex blueprint, a mug of chamomile tea, a pile of zoning applications, and a small framed crayon drawing from her nephew that said, "Auntie Thea builds the best forts." Her phone vibrated. It was a text from Arthur. He sent one every other week, always formal, always concise, and always about Sophie. How is she doing? Did she enjoy the architectural block set I had sent? Is Sunday afternoon a possibility for a visit? Thea replied only to the questions concerning their daughter. The them they used to be was now a blueprint for a building that would never be constructed. She typed her response. Sophie loves the blocks. She tried to eat the miniature Fenway Park. Sunday is fine. My father can arrange the time. She put the phone down and watched Sophie. The baby was now pulling herself up on the edge of the playpen, wobbly but determined. Her deep blue eyes were locked on the mobile of Boston's skyline. You like those, my little engineer? Thea murmured. Sophie let out a happy gurgle that sounded almost like a word. She reached a tiny hand toward the Zockham Bridge, her fingers opening and closing in the air. You'll get there, Thea said softly. Maybe not tomorrow, but you will. The intercom on her desk buzzed. Her assistant's voice was crisp. Miss Caldwell, your father is on line 1. Perfect, she thought, picking up the phone. Dad, I saw the article, he said. You look like a formidable woman. I feel exhausted. That's how you know you're building something that will last, he answered. Thea allowed herself a small smile. How is the Seaport redevelopment project? Ahead of schedule. And how is my granddaughter? Attempting to dismantle a stuffed lobster at this very moment. A true Caldwell, he said with a chuckle. Testing the structural integrity of her world. They spoke for 10 minutes about load-bearing walls and historical preservation grants. They did not speak about Arthur. They had ceased discussing Arthur months ago, not because the topic was painful, but because it had become irrelevant. After the call, Thea moved to the floor-to-ceiling window, 57th floor. The city was a sprawling, intricate design below, a grid of light, energy, and a million separate lives. She was in casual trousers and a cashmere turtleneck, her hair pulled back in a loose knot. The mug of tea on her desk was now lukewarm. She was the exact same woman Arthur had met at a university fundraiser in Cambridge. She had always been this person, in all her facets, the one who read dense books on urban planning, the one who could command a room of contractors, the one who cried during commercials about returning soldiers, the one who could spot a flaw in a building's foundation from a single photograph. She was all of it. She had simply stopped pretending to be only the parts he found convenient. She thought of Arthur, not with anger or bitterness, but with the quiet, stark clarity that follows a demolition, when the dust settles and you can finally see the empty space where you can begin to build anew. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man who had never faced a real problem, raised in a world his mother Catherine had engineered to be perfectly smooth and predictable, demanding no true fortitude. Arthur always took the path of least resistance, not from a place of malice, but because he was profoundly unaware that other harder paths even existed. That, she understood, was his blueprint to follow, not hers to redraw. She thought of Catherine, A woman so terrified of her son escaping her orbit that she systematically dismantled every relationship that threatened her influence. A woman who valued people based on their utility and discarded them the moment they became a liability. A woman who, upon learning of Thea's pregnancy, had referred to their baby as a market complication. Thea didn't despise Catherine. She saw her with absolute clarity, which was, in its own way, more cutting. Understanding the person who caused you pain robs you of the simple release of calling them evil. You have to acknowledge the fact that they were just people, fragile, fearful, and creating catastrophic damage with the same hands they likely used to comfort their own children during a thunderstorm. And then she thought of herself, the woman who had made her world smaller, who had softened her own professional opinions, who had counted to 10 in her head instead of speaking her mind. The woman who lived out of suitcases in spare rooms and sterile hotel suites because she believed that love required you to sand down your own edges to create a smoother fit. That woman wasn't erased. She was part of Thea's history. She would always be a part of the foundation, but she was no longer the architect. Sophie pushed herself up in the play area, her small legs trembling as she stabilized herself. She took a single wobbly step and then another before her diapered bottom met the plush mat with a soft thud. She looked up at her mother, her face a perfect picture of astonishment and pride. Thea laughed, a real warm sound, and knelt beside the enclosure. "That was 2, she whispered. "That was 2 entire steps." Sophie's little hands reached for the brass mobile above her, the intricate models of the city's bridges still just out of her grasp, but closer than they were yesterday. "Come on, my love," Thea said. She lifted her daughter out, the familiar, comforting weight settling on her hip, and carried her to the window. The sun was sinking below the Boston skyline, painting the clouds in hues of fiery orange and soft lavender, with that breathtaking, fleeting indigo that appears only for a moment between dusk and true night. The city lights began to flicker on, one by one. "Do you see all of that?" Thea murmured, her lips near her daughter's small ear. "That is the world. It is vast and noisy and at times incredibly unjust. People will try to tell you who you are. They will hear your name and make assumptions. They will look at you and see only what they want to see." Sophie tangled a fist in her mother's hair. "But you are a Caldwell, and Caldwell women draw their own damn blueprints." She kissed her daughter's cheek, inhaling the sweet, clean scent of baby lotion and limitless potential. The mobile in their apartment would be catching the city lights tonight, casting long shadows across the walls, a collection of shapes inspired by the world's most brilliant female architects. Zaha for her audacity, Eileen for her innovation, Lena for her soul, and Sophie, the most important project of all, who was not just a shadow on a wall, but a warm, living, breathing masterpiece in her arms. Thea turned from the window, placed Sophie back in her playpen, and returned to her own desk. She woke her monitor. There was a project to finish. There was always a project to finish. But first, she picked up her mug of tea and took a sip. It was cold. She drank it anyway. Cold tea, a well-read book on structural engineering, and the deep, unshakable contentment of a woman who had finally stopped asking for a permit to build her own life. For 3 years, she had existed as a shadow in a minimalist penthouse overlooking the Charles River, a guest in her own life. The room designated as a nursery was repurposed into a biohacking chamber without her being consulted. Her own name, once respected in architectural circles, became a footnote to his. Her pregnancy was labeled a disruption to the Q4 forecast. Her morning sickness was waved off as being overly dramatic, and her choice to finally leave was deemed an irrational variable. For 3 years, she had told herself that to be loved, she had to be smaller. That was finished. She now realized the door was never locked. She had been holding the key the entire time, trading her ambition for his approval, her voice for a quiet existence, choosing to be agreeable because it was simpler. But simpler meant a life without challenge, and a life without challenge was a life without meaning. Never again. Her eyes drifted to the tablet on her desk. Her own project was staring back at her, the cover story for a major design magazine, her latest building praised for its bold, uncompromising vision. She wasn't smiling in the photograph, just looking straight at the camera, poised, certain, unmovable. She grabbed her phone and sent a message to Leo. "I'm opening that 25-year-old bottle of scotch tonight. Are you in?" Leo's reply was immediate. "On my way, and I'm bringing backup because I know your capacity for celebration." Thea felt a true smile form as she put the phone down. She took one final look out the expansive window. Boston was coming alive, one building at a time, a constellation of resolute lights pushing back against the darkness. She was one of them now. She walked into her home studio, not because it was the largest room in her new loft, but because it had the clearest view, and she was done with living in anyone's shadow. A final word. This narrative was thoughtfully designed, drafted, and revised by our creative team to offer our audience compelling stories that examine authentic human challenges and deliver a meaningful, resonant experience.